The Reverend Jane Rzepka and the Reverend Ken Sawyer put together a list of ways to give a truly terrible sermon in their excellent book, Thematic Preaching, a great preaching manual for Unitarian Universalist preachers. That list has been added to by students in my preaching class, by a few for me, by folks in the Shared Pulpit class that I've led. Shared Pulpit's a great lay preaching introduction that the Reverend Erica Hewitt put together. I've led with folks a few times. I want to tell you 10 more ways to give a truly terrible sermon. Here we go. Count on inspiration to show up when you want it. That it can be Saturday night at 10 o'clock and you're just going to all of a sudden feel inspired, or that you've got nothing on the page and that all of a sudden you're going to feel the Spirit move in you. Look, both of those things are entirely possible. Certainly some of my best preaching has been when Spirit, whatever that is, I don't know how to square that with your theology, right? But just like shows up and moves through you. I always return, though, to the advice of Louis Pasteur, the scientist, the inventor of pasteurization. He says, chance favors the prepared mind. Chance still matters. Grace still matters, right? This thing larger and greater, inspiration still matters. But it favors the prepared mind, meaning do your homework, write your manuscript. Let your brain be working on what you're going to say for weeks in advance. Know what you're going to preach on. Let it percolate, let it work. Don't just count on inspiration to show up on your schedule. Don't acknowledge Unitarian Universalism. Don't acknowledge Unitarian Universalism. Look, you have the space of the entire service to do this, so it's not that every sermon has to begin and middle and end with, here's Unitarian Universalism as Unitarian Universalists. But the reality is we are preachers located in a particular context, in conversation with a particular tradition, shaped by a certain set of shared values, expressed these days in our 7 principles. Those things aren't incidental. It's not that those just happen to be the case. Those are foundational. And it's important to make that visible and remember that and re-ground people in their home. Preach without including any actual ideas. Here's the thing. You can be extremely entertaining. You can get up in front of a room full of people and have them engaged and laughing and crying and rapt with attention and have nothing underneath that. You can preach, what can you preach? My favorite candy bars, Reese's peanut butter cups, are so good while you're eating them. And even better, the peanut butter eggs, like for Christmas and Easter and Halloween, like those big chunky things full of peanut butter and corn syrup. Man, those are so good while you're eating them. And then almost immediately afterwards, they feel terrible. I mean, before the taste is even out of your mouth, your body's like, oh, why did we make this decision? Your preaching can do that too. You can preach engaging, interesting, fascinating, entertaining stuff with no substance. There's got to be something there. And preach without including any actual ideas. That doesn't just mean like, oh boy, I got to tuck some Socrates into every one of my sermons. Ideas here means something that is real, something that is enduring, something that matters, something that shapes a life and animates it. Toss in dozens of images and stories and quotes and more and more and more. Dude, give people a break. Let them hear what you have to say. They're not going to remember all of your quotes. They're not going to remember all of your images and stories. I tend to think that fewer, better words is a huge improvement over more, worse words. Telling one story that is memorable, that hits your point, that embodies this thing that you're trying to gesture towards, matters so much more. Huge. I can't, the screen is not big enough for me to wave my arms large enough. Less is more in that sense. People remember stories better than they remember concepts and ideas and so on. But people don't remember stories when there's 12 of them in one sermon. Make your preaching so that you can be heard and remembered. So don't toss in dozens of images and stories and quotes. Always in that too, there's so many things that are important to me, quotes that to me really matter and meant a lot, quotations that I've spent years sitting with and digesting. Louis Pasteur, right? Chance favors the prepared mind, that I come back to over and over again at least a few times a year. Your listeners may be hearing everything you're saying for the very first time. You can't give them merely a dessert buffet instead of dinner with a dessert that follows it. Apologize. I'm so sorry that I'm so tired this morning. I'm sorry that I didn't have time to finish this section. I'm sorry. All of this stuff, it draws attention to you instead of to the point that you're making. And there's a way in which, does Emerson talk about being like a transparent pane of glass or something? Like, the point is that the preaching is not about you, the preacher. It's about this thing that you're trying to come across, to get across. That doesn't mean don't give people a heads up if you're going to talk about something horrific, right? But that's different. Instead of, I'm so sorry that we're going to talk about genocide in the sermon today. Like, not that. Because if you're really so sorry, don't talk about it. Talk about something else. That's different than, this is going to be difficult this morning. We're going to face the reality of genocide without mincing words. And that might be really hard. That's not an apology. There is one time where it is okay to apologize. If you come to the pulpit and you're sick, you're hoarse, you're coughing, you're sneezing, give them one apology at the very top and then never mention it again, pretty much no matter how much you're coughing. I've done this before. It's so strange to give this suggestion, though, like in a COVID and post-COVID world, because before, like if I've been fighting a cold, I might come up to the pulpit and say, like, I'm just fighting a little bit of a cold, so apologies if I cough. I'm just fine. Like, I don't know today if we would go to church with a cough anymore like that. But the point is, name it so that you put your listeners at ease, so that they know that you know what's going on. You're coughing, you're sneezing, you have a runny nose, you need a whatever it is, right? And then you don't have to come back to it again. It's not an apology. Cough, cough. Oh, I'm so sorry. Cough, cough. Oh, excuse me. Cough, cough. Because then that's drawing attention back to you instead of this thing that you're trying to get out there. Give a book report. Give a book report. Great. There are so many good, useful, amazing, life-changing books in the world. And a book report does not a sermon make. It may be that there's one book that is the animating idea or concept or message of the whole thing, but that's not the same as having nothing other than a book report in your sermon. Is the book your springboard to an idea, to a concept, to related stories from outside the book, to the experience of what your folks are going through right now? Is the book the thing that propels you into a trajectory that takes your people somewhere, that sends them out into the world or inside themselves? That's different than a book report. I read this thing, here's what it was about. The trick with this and so many things is not to fool yourself. The physicist Richard Feynman says, he's talking about science, but I think it's true in preaching, the most important thing is not to fool yourself. And this is difficult because you are the easiest person in the world for you to fool. So I think of that, like my dog in the background just growled in his sleep. Yeah, don't fool yourself. Pilot will get you. That's true for this book report sermon. This is one sometimes that I can fall into that trap of fooling myself into thinking, oh, no, it's a sermon. But it's really just like, I read this thing. Here's what it said. Yeah, don't do that. Show pictures no one can see. In the First Unitarian Church of Chicago, it is this miniature Gothic cathedral. It's 50 feet high, it's 25 feet wide, and it's 130 feet long. The pulpit is probably 15 to 20 feet away from the very first row of seats in the room. There is nothing at any size short of gigantic that I can show in the front of that room that will be visible to the people in the back. We've got a projector screen that's probably like a 9-foot screen, a 7-foot screen, something like that. Put it up in the chancel. That's good for like the front half of the congregation. But the back of the congregation still can't see it. It's too far away. The chancel isn't raised. There's people's heads in front of them. It's just raised like that much. Show pictures no one can see. Don't do that, because that's an off-ramp. And everyone who can't see them, and folks with vision issues or impaired, there's so many reasons not to do that. You have an image that you absolutely need people to see, you have paper orders of service, say, put it on the cover of your order of service. You have screens in the room that are big enough, awesome, show it on that thing. You have just one thing in the whole sermon that you want to show and nothing else. First, can you describe it instead? And second, can you put it in a place that's actually visible to people that doesn't interrupt the flow of what you're saying? Assume that the sermon will carry itself without any stories or humor. Whew. I've definitely preached those sermons sometimes. They were terrible. Because people remember stories, they engage with stories, they participate in stories. Humor can be an on-ramp, a connection point, a relationship point. It's not that every sermon has to be funny. Don't do that. Don't fall into the trap of seeking laughs because it feels good to make people laugh. It does feel good. It feels great. But is that actually serving the thing that you're preaching? Or is that just something that makes you feel nice as a preacher? Don't chase that. But a sermon that is entirely, abstract philosophizing and conceptual ideation is not a sermon, because no one's going to remember what you said at all. Show off your impressive vocabulary. While this is indubitably an eventuality, I can't even do it right now. Don't, who is it says, maybe George Orwell in one of his essays, I think, says, has this list of rules for writing, might actually be E.B. White, says, don't use a small word, don't use a long word when a diminutive one will do. Well, why are you using those really long, impressive vocabulary words. It's not for their benefit, because you're losing people in the room when you use stuff that they don't know. It's not that you can't use impressive vocabulary words, but impressive vocabulary is jargon. And jargon is something that distances people rather than brings them closer. Jargon is something that is an off-ramp from your sermon rather than an on-ramp, rather than a coming closer. Jargon is something that shows, makes visible the form, instead of letting the form combine with the message that you're actually trying to send. I know you have an impressive vocabulary. Your vocabulary is great. Nobody cares. Like, you don't need to show off like that, man. You're fine. You're fine. Use it with me. That's okay. Don't use it with them. Finally, for this run of ways not to preach. Number 10, ignore local context and world events. Preach generic sermons. My experience is that it's relatively rare that world events, whether in your community, in the congregation, or in your town or city, or in your country, or in the world, it's rare that those rise to the level that I need to throw out my whole sermon and start over again from scratch. But it happens, and it happens regularly. I think of George Floyd's murder. On Saturday, we sat down. I'm pretty sure it was Saturday. On Saturday, we sat down as a worship team and basically said to each other, all right, we're not doing anything we planned to do this week, so what are we doing? And scrambled and put together a very different service in the course of 24 hours. That's the most extreme example. But there's a whole spectrum leading up to that level of crisis that needs answer. It's not the case that the sermon is the only place you can do this. Often I'll do that in the call to worship. So I think about like the Women's March, the weekend after Trump's election. I was here in Chicago and went, a whole crew of folks from the congregation went. My spouse and co-minister went and came back and wrote a chalice lighting that was pretty substantial, that spoke to what that experience was and why it mattered. And then there was, a touch point or a reference maybe in the sermon, an allusion back to that. It wasn't that the sermon was about that. But if that had happened, if 24 people from our smallish congregation had gone to this march and come back and heard nothing about it in church, and if 100,000, however many people it was, had gathered downtown, and there was no mention of this whatsoever, that would have been weird. That would have been so weird, because the Sunday morning experience would not have been in the actual world that we all live in. It would have been in some abstracted and unreal place. So don't ignore local context. Don't ignore world events. Don't preach purely generic sermons. Connect them to where you are. Beverly Unitarian Church in the southwest corner of Chicago, where I've served for a few years, did a massive renovation project. This old 1870s mansion was coming down, and the small congregation astonishingly beautifully raised the money to restore this place. It's an incredible success story that anyone would have bet against. When I preached there during those years, because it was years, it was a year of figuring out what to do, and a year of fundraising, and a year of construction, it wasn't that every single Sunday I was preaching about that. But rare was the Sunday where it didn't show up at least somewhere or another, as a candlelit during joys and concerns, or as a reference in the sermon, not more than a sentence necessarily, but as they moved through this process, and this was the biggest thing going on in the congregation. We're talking now about local context, not events outside, but inside too matter. It was a way to help tell their story back to them over time and the different phases of that journey that they were on together. Not in the main topic of the sermon at every moment, but most weeks, most months at least, some little bit of naming that reminds us where we are and grounds us in that. I think about this too, like an example at First Unitarian, they worked very hard on a good relations team who defined channels for conflict. So when two people are in conflict with each other, what do you do with that? And they figured out, here's the flow chart of all the different ways to do that. And so that shows up in the sermon because this is a big thing in the life and culture of the congregation. Again, it doesn't mean that every sermon you preach is only about what's going on that week or in that place or moment. It really just means don't ignore those realities and use your best judgment about how they need to show up in the preaching. And also in the service as a whole, because you've got the whole service as a united whole, and maybe that goes elsewhere. All right, we're down to the last 23 more things not to do. Next video.